Most people have great respect for police officers, for law enforcement, as one should. They protect society, they protect us from criminals. They run into the gunfire literally. But have you heard this name? Jason Van Dyke. You may know him from 2014, but let's start with who was Jason Van Dyke. He was a police officer, and here's a little bit about him. He was born in Illinois. He went to high school. After he graduated from high school, he got his bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Xavier University, a great university in Chicago. So he did everything to become a police officer. That's what he wanted to do for a living. So in 2001, he met his goal. He became a police officer to protect each of us. He did that for 14 years and he got married. He had two children, going along swimmingly in terms of a law enforcement career. And then the unthinkable for anyone who is a law enforcement officer responding to a call in uniform, on duty, officer involved shooting. But in this case, he was not shot. He was the shooter. You may remember the name of the victim, Laquan McDonald, 17 years old. He was shot and killed with Officer Van Dyke behind the gun. 16 shots were fired in 14 to 15 seconds. Pretty unthinkable. The sin, the motive in this case, gluttony, excess. Why would this officer, what would motivate this officer to shoot a victim 16 times? I'm Ashley Willcott. As a TV anchor, a former judge, and a former trial attorney, I must tell you, I would say almost every single case that I've been exposed to shows one of the seven deadly sins as the motive of the case. They intersect. The seven deadly sins: pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. The opposite of the seven heavenly virtues. Temptations that, taken too far, turn deadly. In this instance, a police officer entrusted with protecting the public, he shot 16 times in a matter of 14 to 15 seconds, the victim in this case, Laquan McDonald. This week, we delve into the case of Jason Van Dyke, a police officer entrusted with protecting the public. And what does he do? He fires his gun 16 times in a matter of 14 to 15 seconds, killing 17-year-old Laquan McDonald. A little bit later, I am joined by Dr. Laura Pettler, an expert forensics analyst. And here's what's really significant. She actually developed a tool that is used by law enforcement today to look at the path of shots fired to determine the cause of death, how it happened, who the person was, where they were standing. It's miraculous. She's going to help us do a deep dive on this case. Let's get into it. This is the Deadly Seven. Let's turn to October 20th of 2014, and officers responded to a 911 call. They were on duty, they're in uniform, and they received a call that a 17-year-old, later identified as Laquan McDonald, was reportedly carrying a knife, and he was breaking into vehicles in a trucking yard. So the officers responded, and as they are trained to do, they confronted this 17-year-old. Now, allegedly, when they did that, Laquan used the knife that he had to slash a tire on one of the police cars and also to then damage the windshield of the police car. And later, we learn, he also had PCP in his system, but police didn't know that at the time. So he is resisting arrest. He is taking actions to damage the car, putting them at risk, arguably. And as police are arriving, one of the last officers to arrive, along with his partner, was Jason Van Dyke. Do you know, within 30 seconds of Officer Van Dyke getting out of his police vehicle, he began firing his state-issued gun at McDonald 14 to 15 seconds. That is no time at all. Within that time frame, he fired 16 shots at Laquan McDonald. Now, remember, he did have a knife. He was not attacking the actual officers. He was vandalizing their car. But this is the scene when he pulled up, and he was one of the last officers to arrive. What's really interesting in this case, let's walk through this together, is contradicting reports about what happened when Van Dyke arrived. It showed, the first report, that McDonald was shot a total of 16 times, as I mentioned, and that 9 of the 16 shots were at a downward angle. Use your common sense what that means. McDonald was surrendering, was on the ground, was not attacking. 9 of the 16 shots at a downward angle. A lot cried excessive force was used. That was the rally cry. And the police said, including Van Dyke, no excessive force. Let's describe what happened. Several of the officers were accused of filing false reports, including Van Dyke, because they said that this 17-year-old was aggressive, was lunging, was a threat to their persons. They're police officers. Generally, what goes in their reports is believed. So it was believed that he was the aggressor and that these actions taken by Van Dyke were therefore not excessive. But listen to this. The most critical piece of evidence, what would you think it is? Video, dash cam video, even better. Police always have a dash cam video. Well, initially, nobody saw that. So you have all these outcries about what happened, excessive force, and there's no dash cam video. Until a year later, in November of 2015, the only reason it was released was because of a court order. And guess what that showed? The exact opposite of what the police reports claimed. They claimed again that he lunged at the officers. He was an immediate threat. But get this, the dash cam video shows the 17-year-old victim, Laquan McDonald, walking away from Jason Van Dyke and all of the other officers, walking away from them. He was veering away, you can see it on the video, into a fence. Guess what else the video showed? The first shot was fired as McDonald was walking away. He was no threat. He was walking away from the crime scene. It also showed that Van Dyke continued shooting at McDonald even after, you see on the video, remember, the victim's walking away, shot in his back. He's spinning. He hits the ground. The entire time he's spinning and hits the ground, he's being shot at by the officer, Van Dyke. He was literally crumpled on the street, still holding the knife. Crumpled meaning not moving, not attacking, not resisting. During that time on the video, you can see more of the shots hit him. All of those shots were made by Jason Van Dyke. All 16 bullet casings recovered at the scene identified as coming from his gun issued as a police officer. No doubt, no other officers on scene fired their weapons. No doubt, this is what he did. And keep this in mind, all 16 shots, that is the capacity of his weapon. That's as many shots as he could have fired from that firearm. He fired every one of those shots. That graphic dash cam video was really the forensic evidence that was needed to seal the fate of Jason Van Dyke. What happened is he did choose to go to trial. Everyone's presumed innocent, has a right to have a trial, and he was convicted of murder. Dr. Laura Pettler, forensic criminologist, and we were just talking about what that means. And what that means is you don't just look at the forensics and the science, you also look at the behaviors of a murderer. So let me just jump right in. Again, Van Dyke was convicted of second-degree murder along with a lot of other charges, but that's the main one I want to focus on. And what I think is it's gluttony. He acted in excess because, again, he shot this 17-year-old 16 times. So, what's the first thing that you think of in terms of you go to a crime scene and you see an individual on the ground still holding a knife? They've been shot multiple times. You later learn it's 16 times, and you know it's at the hand of an officer because nobody else is there. How do you first process something like that?
Judge Ashley, it's a very complicated scene when you have something that's multiple gunshot wounds to a victim because you have to consider movement. That's the first thing that I'm looking at. Obviously the I'm not even going to discuss the obvious things of securing the scene, securing the evidence, and all of those normal things that people would do. But it's more, what are we going to do at autopsy to help us move forward towards some type of reconstruction? Because clearly in these kinds of cases, especially with such a high number of gunshot wounds, there's going to be the element where people are going to ask what happened and why so many gunshot wounds and how did it happen. So the autopsy is going to be critically important. So I'm going to be thinking about preserving the body the best way possible, getting it to autopsy, and what we're going to do medically in partnership with the forensic pathologist and the team there, in tandem with the detectives and law enforcement that are involved to begin the process of reconstruction.
And when you begin that process of reconstruction, at that point, autopsy to reconstruct what happened, do you take, Dr. Laura, into account what the police officers say happened? Because we know that Van Dyke and his partner were two of the last police officers to arrive. There were multiple police statements given saying that the victim was the aggressor, that he was lunging at them with a knife. How much of that do you take into account when you first start processing to reconstruct?
Well, personally, Ashley, at Laura Pettler and Associates Death Investigations, we use a method called the murder room. And the murder room method is a six-stage, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, quantitative, qualitative, decedent-centered method. And it's got a bunch of fail-safes built in to try to prevent investigators from jumping ahead and drawing conclusions early in the process as opposed to at the end of the process once we've gone through the scientific method in stage 4. So for me, I would take into account everything that every witness is saying, including the alleged shooter in the case, and all of that would fall into place for analysis for us in stage 4, steps 1 through 6, and it would culminate into the actual shooting reconstruction in stage 4, step 7. From that point, we would then pare down the critical evidence that was gleaned from the witness statements that tested to be true in one of the hypotheses of the scientific method process of reconstruction, which would then be synthesized in stage 5, and then opinions and conclusions, merit and worth, value would be then rendered in stage 6 based on the totality of circumstances.
It's the murder room. You and I have talked about this a lot. When we've traveled, we've gone to conferences, we talk about this
Yes.
because I'm fascinated, and I think it's the comprehensive approach that's so important because this case really highlights if you don't have the comprehensive approach and evidence, you're going to get to the wrong conclusions. And that's what initially happened in this case. They thought, okay, yes, he was the aggressor. Laquan McDonald was the one that was going after the officers. And so there was a shooting by a police officer. And at the end of the day, we know the conviction did not support that version of what happened. So now let's marry it with behavior because there are a couple of behaviors I want to talk about. Not only the behavior of the police officer, but the behavior of the victim. So I want to start by sharing with you some information about McDonald, 17-year-old. And it just makes me so heartbroken because I will tell anyone, number one, I advocate for kids. You know that my entire
Yes.
career. He was only
Yep.
17. He's still a darn kid. And number two, our country, as great as it is, doesn't have sufficient mental health facilities to
They
meet
do
the needs
not.
of those with issues. So
Right.
we know that McDonald had learning disabilities and mental health issues. He had a history of some arrests as a juvenile, but with that history, not surprising. And then we know from the autopsy that he had PCP in his system at the time of his death. And so all of those things can contribute to the behavior that was described of him. They said that it was a little bizarre during the shooting and the behavior that he was exhibiting. And for instance, when the police first got there and he had a knife, he allegedly broke the windshield on the car. He then also stabbed one of the police officer tires. He did things that you would hope one would resist doing and not get in more trouble for those actions. So those behaviors and knowing him and some of his needs, what do you do with that when you're reconstructing what in the world happened at this crime scene?
For me personally, as a forensic criminologist, I would take into consideration all of his victimology because it's the foundation of our system because we are a decedent centered system in the murder room. So all of those behaviors actually would be critically important to understanding what would be his normal routine versus what would he do under duress. How does he handle conflict and how does he handle frustration? Sometimes people have some people have a very high tolerance to frustration and can work through it. It sounds like that in this case, he might have had a lower level of ability to tolerate frustration and maybe lashing out or behaving outwardly and exhibiting frustration by slashing tires or doing other things to explain to express how he was feeling. So his emotionality is critically important, which gives way to understanding his thinking because in the behavioral chain, so to speak, there's always a trigger. And in this case, I'm not sure what the trigger was. I'm not as familiar with the case as you are. But there was some trigger that created some emotion for him. And from emotion, we get cognition or thinking. And then from thinking, we get a behavior. So I would actually track it all the way back to the trigger and I would go in that sequence of trigger, emotion, thought, behavior, and that would help me explain each of the behaviors and then isolate which ones are critical evidence and which ones would be sequestered under our white noise section. Because there definitely are always things that we want to include, but then there are also things that are kind of extraneous variables that we have to weigh and we have to analyze very properly in stage 4 to determine whether or not they are white noise. And if they are indeed white noise, they need to be sequestered and not be let into the quantitative elements of the reconstruction.
Because, I don't know what the trigger is either, Laura. There's so many different aspects to this case, but I can tell you a little bit more of what we know about Laquan. He had a teenage mother. There was
Okay.
no father present in his life. At 3 years old, the teenage mother couldn't take care of him, so he was in foster care, and he did live with relatives through a lot of his time in foster care, but we also know that at the time of his death, he was a ward of the state. Now, I'll tell anybody, should a state have to be responsible for raising a child? Absolutely not. It's not the best parent. However, if a child's being abused and neglected, should the state have to step in to protect the child and raise the child? Absolutely. And so that's a little bit more of what we know. And I have to just say one more thing about him as the victim in this case. A teacher described him as very respectful and reserved and not
Mm,
aggressive. So I think when you look at
mm,
the whole picture, some of the aggression he displayed was not typical of his
right.
personality. So
That's
let me
right.
see if you have any other thoughts on that. And then I want to talk about the shooter.
Absolutely. So that go again, that supports our premise at LPA that the victimology is the core of your investigation. It's not th- a part of it. It is the reason why we're all there, because there is a victim and there is he's now deceased. When it comes to victimology, we use a 5-gauge system to understand victims in totality. So we start with, do they have shelter? Do they have water? Do they have food? Do they have air to breathe? And that's usually the first things that we want to evaluate. What you're describing here is a pretty dangerous situation if the person that his mother at the time could not take care of him anymore and he became ward of the state. So then, what kind of environment was he living in? Then we move to security and safety. Did he feel safe with the people he was with? Did he feel secure in his relationship? So we study all of that. Then we move into love and belonging and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Did he feel connected and part of his family or part of a group, even if it's a group home or a foster care situation? Normally, that's where we'll find conflict in domestic violence homicide, and that leads us to why the victim ended up dead. But then, of course, as you know, Maslow talks about self-actualization of being the pinnacle and having to have this self-esteem and self-acceptance. For a kid of his age, we're not going to get there in our victimological study. He's not going to be there. But what we hear from the teacher is the teacher saying he's a reserved kid. He's quiet, he's respectful, he's not been aggressive. So then we use this acronym, because I'm always creating things. This acronym we call GESC, and it stands for Geno Enviro Socioculturalism, because I got tired of writing every time I had to write something about a subject, well, their biology and their environment and their societal aspects and their cultural aspects. And so we just call it GESC now,
I
in
love
working
that
here.
acronym. That's smart. I
Thank you.
like that.
GESC, Geno-Enviro Socioculturalism. And what that is the aggregate, the totality of how this person's biological personality, behavioral patterns, thinking patterns, and emotionality are affected by their environment, society, cultural institutions. You cannot understand murder in totality or a victim's behavior during the commission of a murder in totality without studying their GESC. Of course, we study the GESC of the shooter as well, but what you're describing to me falls under our category of GESC in our victimological study. So we would take those accounts of what people are saying, like the teacher, into consideration when we're saying, what are the routine activities of this person? How did they deal with conflict? How did they deal with frustration and anger, the emotion of anger? It's the number one reported emotion by killers, of course, in these types of situations. But, what was the trigger for him that he was, did he not want to go back to jail? Sometimes they'll do that. They'll fight back because they don't want to go to jail. There's lots of reasons why they do that. So we would study the victim and then again, extract the critical pieces that we make sure are colored green. So everything in the murder room that is valid and reliable, we categorize under green in the murder room. If it's partially valid or partially reliable, we categorize it under yellow. And if it's not provable, if it's invalid, if it's unreliable, we put it in red. It doesn't mean it's unimportant. It just means we can't prove it right now.
Okay.
So,
So
that's
let me
what we would do.
let me interrupt you because I have to bring up the green valid now for the shooter and what you would do with this information. So again, when I was looking at the 7 deadly sins and gluttony, habitual greed or excess. So keep that in mind, habitual greed or excess. And here's some excess I want to share with you. These are behaviors that are established by the records pertaining to the shooter, right? So during his career as a police officer, Laura, we know that Van Dyke had 20 citizen complaints filed against him in 14 years, 20. We know that none of those resulted in disciplinary action. That to me, I would say is invalid, put over here, whatever. It doesn't matter to me. But aside from that, 10 of the 20 complaints involved excessive force. 2 involved the use of a firearm. In one instance, a jury actually awarded a man $350,000 because they said that Van Dyke, in a civil case, used excessive force during a traffic stop. Now, again, that was in a civil case. He didn't have any criminal charges. He didn't have any disciplinary action. There was another one where a complaint involved verbal abuse because it was said Van Dyke used a racial slur. And then there was a different shooting in 2005. This was in 2014, so way back in 2005. And he was involved in preparing questionable documentation of the shooting involving police from 2005. So now to me, that's green reliable. You tell me if I'm wrong and I'm not interpreting the murder room correctly, but I think that's important information in looking then at how did this happen and did Van Dyke murder this victim or not?
Oh, absolutely. And what you're describing is a power assertive offender that's in a police uniform. I mean, that's basically what you're describing. So we have lots of power-based or anger-based murders, and then there's some that are a combination of anger and power. In this particular situation, what you're describing is a power-based offender who really likes to be in charge, and the interest in homicide is the ultimate control. Of course, we see this a lot in domestic violence homicides, but in this particular case, the fact that when you mentioned that he had 20 um, issues prior to this, I think is what you said, there was no disciplinary action. In order for any behavior to change, there has to be some type of a motivator. Obviously, we all know that fear is the greatest motivator of behavior, the absolute number one. And if he had no fear of consequences because after the first time nothing happened, the second time nothing happened, the third time, the fourth time, the sixth time, the eighth time, 15th time, 18th time, the 20th time, nothing happened. So there is no reason to change the behavior. So it becomes more aggressive. The more the threat, the more a victim pushes back against the power assertive offender, the more layers of injury we often see to those victims. They can be kind of like the Jodi Arias, Travis Alexander scene, where if he pushed back, not only do we have anger all over that scene, but it's reflective of power where, if he originally might have, and I'm just using that example from the layers of injury. You had stab wounds, you had assault, like physical injury, and then you had gunshot wounds. So when you have a gun involved with firearm, like in this case, in this Van Dyke case, the firearm is an extension of the power of the offender. And so they're most often likely to use whatever is symbolic of power to them. And they obviously use the weapon that they carry most often. So, of course, for him, the badge, the uniform, the firearm, all of that is symbolic of power to him. So that's why he chose that particular weapon as opposed to his hands, because internally, inside, he feels like a very, very small, invisible, not powerful person. So he has to use all of this excess to make himself important, relevant, visible, and in control of
And
everybody
he
else.
And he did it immediately, Laura. We know, again, he and his partner were the last officers to arrive, but less than 30 seconds after they pulled up and about 6 seconds after he got out of the vehicle, that's when Van Dyke began firing his gun, the semi-automatic 9 millimeter, and it all happened that quickly, and there were 16 shots.
It's
That to me.
impulsive.
Right, right, and
Yes,
again, I go
it's
back
it's
to the
impulsive, and that
excessiveness.
and that goes to that personality type. That personality type of killer can be extremely impulsive. They typically, maybe sometimes they don't make it through high school. They get dishonorably discharged from the military. They are always like that person in the bar that wants to fight with somebody in a bar that like just looks at them across the bar, and the next thing you know, they're like, "What are you looking at? What are you looking at? You got a problem? You got a problem?" They're always looking for that. They're banned from bars all the time. They often leech off of a female. They'll live with their mother. They'll live with another female and just kind of leech off of that person. They often are involved in martial arts. They're involved in like combat kind of stuff that they like, anything that they can do to feel powerful and
Yeah.
to feel like to get that rush and that the impulsion, to jump out of the car and just start shooting, it is gives them a rush, quite frankly.
Ugh, it's disgusting, really, and I'm glad that he was convicted. But all right, forensic criminologist, imagine if you would that you have a case at the murder room that you are working on the reconstruction. And a year later, you finally get access to the video cam from the police car. 1 year, the only way you ever get it, that anyone ever sees it, is because a court finally orders it and says, this is to be released. And when you get that, you see on the video that everything the statements say from the police officers is contradicted by the video. Because the video shows then the first shot was fired, Dr. Laura, it was at the back of the victim. It shows that all of the gunshots were fired by Van Dyke. It shows that he was spinning, the victim was spinning and falling to the ground, and he kept
Mhm.
getting shot. He was on the ground, crumbled on the ground. He wasn't moving, he wasn't resisting, probably wasn't
Right.
alive, quite frankly. He had the knife in his hand, and Van Dyke kept shooting him. What does all
Right.
that speak to you?
It can be anger, it can just be an emotional cathartic experience to just be dumping whatever it is that's internal from this Van Dyke offender, how he feels about his whole life, dumping into this offender. The spinning is what we were talking about when we first started this conversation. I was talking about autopsy and the movement. We have to consider movement of the victim. Oftentimes they are spinning, and the spinning is very common. And so when we're reconstructing the projectiles, obviously, once they're no longer a threat, they're on the ground. Sometimes they're face down, even. We still have offenders that are moving around their bodies, still dumping bullets into them. And it's literally just this dumping of almost like a rage. It's like, are you angry because there's a confrontation between your department and your fellow officers and this offender? Do you know him from a prior instance? Like, that wouldn't matter to Van Dyke because his behavior is consistent with impulsive, aggressive attack at every turn. It sounds like he has a lot of problems with control, impulse control. If he's been cited that many times for use of force and all of those types of behaviors and that pattern, it's not what the victim is doing at all. It's just the mental capacity and the perception, the personality, the emotionality, and everything combined, that Jesk aspect of the offender. If we look back in his history, you're going to find all the reasons why he's like that, and it will not be a shock why he is the way he is. It does not make it excusable whatsoever. But in my line of work, I like to be able to explain behavior. It doesn't rationalize it. It doesn't make it it doesn't exculpate them. It just explains why they are that way. Um and we know a lot most behavior is always trackable, measurable, and mappable backwards.
So you're being pretty modest. So I'm going to share with everyone listening and watching this podcast the reality of something you invented, because we know, and it was part of what the jury heard. He did plead not guilty. He did go to a jury trial. And one of the things they heard were the number of shots that were done at a downward angle, right? So when they're trying to say he was the aggressor, he was coming after us with a knife, well, if you're shooting downward, that's not likely the right
Right.
scenario. And the
That's
the
right.
reason I mention that is I've seen your demonstrations, and it's amazing how it's such a simple idea but genius, because you have a device where you can point through a body, for instance, or through a wall, the hole where a bullet's gone,
Yes.
and then you
Yes.
can see through the laser you invented where it goes, where it the direction it
Point A,
was.
point B, point C.
And those forensics are invaluable, because without the forensics, even without the video, once you have forensics that say, okay, a number of the shots were downward, that tells the jury a whole lot about what didn't happen, right? Or when he shot in his back. So
It
I think the
does.
forensics is really key.
It does, and the thing about reconstruction that I cannot get across enough is it doesn't matter if it's accident reconstruction, shooting reconstruction, bloodstain reconstruction, is that there's 3 types of what people commonly refer to as reconstruction. There is recreation, which is theatrical, reenactment, which is also theatrical, and then you have reconstruction, which has a scientific component. But it is extremely limited, and reconstruction gives you a glimpse of the event at best. And recognizing the limitations of reconstruction is paramount to the success of the reconstruction because it can be easily perceived where lay people or juries even can overreach with the results of a recon. So when you have a victim on the ground and they're being shot in a downward angle, we use those lasers, of course, as you mentioned, to mount onto tripods and then shoot through what you mentioned, the tubular dowels that we invented in 2009. And it shows you these trajectories of the projectiles through air and then through the bodies. And in this particular case, it would be an extreme demonstration with 16 lasers. I've done it with up to 5 lasers on the same body, and we've done many cases with multiple gunshot wounds. Like the one I'm thinking of in my mind is 13 gunshot wounds. And once I came back and said the victim was spinning, the victim then was on the ground, and I explained it, they didn't even make me recon it because I actually could recon it in my head. And
Oh,
I didn't even have to build it. But like the recon is critically important for the visualization for people to see it, but you cannot overreach with the recon. You've got to be ultra conservative and or it'll get you in big trouble, almost like eyewitness testimony. So the downward trajectories are important to me to show to me the heinous and atrociousness of the fact that you had a human being on the ground that was no longer a threat in your eyes and you're still unloading bullets in his body. But a lot of officer involved shootings I have seen do result in multiple gunshot wounds.
mm. And add to this, I want to get your final thoughts because the good news is, and I watched the case unfold, the evidence was all presented. The investigation was well done. Once the video came out and it told the whole story, in the meantime, other officers were charged and were convicted of falsifying reports because they did that. So they did face criminal charges as well. But at the end of the day, he was convicted by a jury of second-degree murder and 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm. This happened in
There's your
2018.
dumping, the dumping behavior. They charged him with the dumping of anger behavior, the impulsive behavior.
And I'm
That's what
glad
should have
that
happened. That's what should have happened 20 citations ago. Had they charged him and disciplined him 20 citations ago, this young man may not have lost his life that day with 16 bullets in his body.
I agree with you, Laura. And get this, he was only sentenced to 81 months. 81 months is just a little bit under 7 years. He's out. He got out for good behavior early in February 2022. Surprised or not at that sentence?
It would depend on the state. Uh, it's very dependent on the state. Judge Ashley, you know that as well as I do. There's some states that if you kill in their state, they are sending you, they got a fast lane to the electric chair or to the gas chamber. And then there's other states that are gonna be just more defendant friendly that are gonna give you light sentences. Not to mention the cultural aspect of sentencing where in North Carolina, in Mecklenburg County, the sentence for murder may be 5 years, but in 3 counties over in a rural county, it could be the most common is 25 years. So it's a big difference depending on what state you're in, what part of the state you're in, and the culture of that state or
I don't
any
think it'll.
county.
Let me tell you where, and I'm just going to get your honest reaction because you don't know where. Chicago,
No.
Illinois. Chicago, Illinois.
Yes, I'm not as familiar with, their sentences as I am the number of violent crimes that they have, and it would not surprise me that it was a lighter, smaller, less robust sentence in Chicago than it would be in Dallas or, Virginia, Florida. You're gonna
And
you're gonna
and
get in
some
trouble
people
there.
Yeah, and some people say there are a lot of corrupt police in Chicago. There's a lot of that mentality, and so the cover up, and this one was an alleged cover up, and then we learned it in fact was a cover up. Does that play into the sentence? I don't know. I was surprised it wasn't a longer sentence, but he is back out on the street. Dr. Laura Pettler, what is your newest title? Tell us that, and I can't thank you enough for joining today.
Thank you, Judge Ashley, for having me. It's always an honor to work with you. I appreciate the invitation to join today. My newest title is Deputy Coroner Commander Dr. Laura Pettler of the Lancaster County, South Carolina Coroner's Office Mounted Response Unit. We are the very first coroner's office based mounted response unit in the United States. And the assistant commander of our unit is our dear friend, um, Assistant Commander Cheryl McCollum, renowned CSI, and she and I, together with Coroner Carla Deese, command a unit of 16 office, 16 horses, 8 of whom are sworn deputy coroners, Judge Ashley. And of those sworn deputy coroner equines, we have 5 of them that have been rescued from auction or from the kill pen that we have repurposed for public safety. And so we are a unit that is committed to helping people and animals. And we are very proud of being the first in the United States to embark on such a journey to create a unit of this nature that will serve the public.
You continue to pave the way. I'm honored to call you
Thank
a
you.
friend, and thank you so much for all your great information weighing in on this case. I don't know. I don't think 7 years is enough. Let us know what you think. Van Dyke out for good behavior in February of 2022.